we left off, we're in James chapter 4. We're talking about the miseries that are going to come on the rich. That's kind of, we left off with about verse 4, and just kind of get us caught up. In the previous lesson, he was talking about their gold and silver would be cankered or corroded. Their garments are moth-eaten because they have hoarded it. So he mentions two or three things that condemn the rich. One is that they don't give as they should, and we talked a little bit about that, about the importance or the necessity of giving. If in other words, we have it, that we've been given what we've given to help others, and so there's a measure of that, a portion of that we ought to use for others. But the ones that he's condemning here hoarded it. They kept back more than they should have kept back. Again, it's kind of a subjective thing, but in the mind of God, he knows, and you and I know, what about our giving? How should we give? Sometimes we talk about 10% or 20% or 30%. That's not what the Bible says. Back in the day, the 10% in the Jewish age, I heard Brother Black say one time it was probably more like 30% or 33% or whatever, if you figured up everything. But with us, he doesn't put a number on it, does he? What does he say? As you've been prospered. So you and I have to make that determination about what we have been prospered, how God has blessed us, so that we give back. Sometimes I use the expression, we give back in proportion as what he's given to us. Well, if we gave it all, that still wouldn't be enough in one sense. Everything comes from him, but we give back to help the church, to help benevolent work, to help the preaching of the gospel, both locally and in other parts of the world. But here you have a group of people that kept back. They just hoarded it. And it kind of reminds me a little bit about the one-talent man that's talked about in Matthew chapter 25. He wasn't condemned for the lack of what he had. He was condemned because he didn't use it. And so I think this is what he's talking about, the wealthy here, the rich people here. And he talked a lot about that. We mentioned the fact that Jesus said, how hard is it for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? Very, very difficult. Camel going through the eye of a needle rather than a rich man going to heaven. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but what he's saying is that sometimes the wealthy have a tendency to keep back or to hoard or to use it for their own gratification, whether it's a sensual gratification, or they just keep back more than they need. And so that's kind of the first part of this that he's talking about there in the first 2 or 3 verses of this chapter. And then he gets into a second thing where the second condemnation here is that people under you or employees of yours, you keep back what you should give them as a fair wage. You defraud them. So that's the second condemnation. So one is you hoard what you got. The second one that he mentions here, which let me just read it in verse. Let's just start with verse 3. Let's start with verse 2. Let's start with verse 1. He says, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver is cankered. The rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. In other words, there's going to be a day of reckoning. There's going to be a day of vengeance, is what he's saying. You've heaped treasure together for the last days. Well, that treasure we talked about is not going to be what they expect. That treasure is going to be the vengeance of God. It's going to be retribution on God's part. It's going to be punishment, is what he's talking about there. And then in verse 4, behold, the hire of the laborers. So this is the second point. The hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth. In other words, the people that you defrauded are crying to me. They cry. And the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, or the Lord of hosts that we're talking about. Scott, you asked about the word host. I looked that up in Webster's dictionary, and it talked about, in other words, a great number. And I don't know, Israel made a comment about that last week as well. So the Lord of hosts, in other words, he's Lord of everything, if you want to look at it that way, or Lord of everybody in that sense, a Lord of hosts. A host means a great number of people. And so I'm not sure if that's what it means. It's not talking about the Sabbath as the seventh day, because this word is S-A-B-A-O-T-H rather than S-A-B-B-A-T-H. So it's talking about a great number of people, I suppose, that he's talking about there. So he says, these people that have taken care of you, they've looked after you, and so the first phrase is, which of you is kept back by fraud? And we started talking about this a little bit the other day. And so the Greek word, another word is defraud. You know, you've defrauded that person, that you have not given them what they earned. Now, we talked a little bit about last week about the scourge of slavery and how a slave owner would be like that. In other words, you got people that are, back in the day, 150, 160, 180 years ago, and Barnes in his commentary went into that quite a bit about a slave owner would be in that category because, you know, the people that are taking care of you, you don't pay them what they need to be paid. In other words, they just barely existing. Subsistence, I guess, is what it would be. But it goes beyond that. It's just any employer or anybody that's under you in that sense. You keep it back. Payment is withheld. In other words, you need to pay them a certain amount to compensate them fairly, and kind of like taxes. The Democrats talk about pay your fair share. You know, let's pay our fair share. You know, kind of thing. Let's be fair about it, pay our fair share. So, and I don't think that's what it's talking about here. But what it's talking about here is that you got somebody that you can compensate, but the person that needs the money can't do anything about it. In other words, this person cannot do a single thing about it. They're working for nothing, as it were, or they're working for just barely nothing. You know, sometimes we talk about it in China and other places where they talk about the sweatshops and different things, where you know, our companies send their companies over, you know, to produce these things in China and so forth and so on, and somebody works for, you know, 30 cents an hour, 50 cents an hour, or whatever. We're over here, they'd make $15 an hour or whatever. And so I think this is kind of what it's talking about here, that it's a fraudulent kind of thing. You keep it back, you withhold it, the claim that they have on it is not rectified, you evade paying them. And as a result, the ones in this category that's being defrauded, they cry out to God. In other words, they're crying out to God, as it were, for punishment. When are you going to take care? When are you going to take care of these people that are mistreating us, that are defrauding us? And he says, and their cries come up before God. And this is what it's saying here. And the cries of them which have reaped, in other words, have reaped down your fields and so forth, or entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. In other words, he does hear their cry. In other words, he is a merciful God. He hears them, and he's going to attend to their cry at some point in time. Now, it doesn't mean that it's all going to be rectified in this life, because when he goes on into this, the indication is that there is going to be a time when everything's going to be settled fairly, and that, of course, is going to be the day of judgment. It's kind of intimated here, doesn't really say that as such, but that's what some of the scholars seem to think, that these people are oppressed, they are wronged, they cry out for God to redress their wrongs, to help them to solve the problem that they're undergoing here, and in His time, He's going to do it. He's not going to do it according to our timetable. I was going to mention that later on. I think we mentioned last week about, and Joel mentioned this one of the sermons a while back, in Revelation 6, about those that have been slaughtered or beheaded for the cause of Christ. How long, O Lord, how long is it going to be before you avenge us for what they did to us, kind of thing. It's almost like these people are crying out the same kind of way. How long is it going to be, God, before you take care of that? But He is going to vindicate those that are oppressed. what does he say in Romans 12? I think it's verse 19. Vengeance belongs to me. I will repay, saith the Lord. So you can go back and see what Paul says about it, and others along that same line. So, and then Barnes kind of mentions this before we get into verse 5. He says, nothing's more certain than that the whole system of slavery is condemned by the passage of Scripture before us, that it is contrary to the genuine spirit of Christianity, and that the prevalence of true religion would bring it to an end. Of course, it was brought to an end in this country, but you've got it in many parts of the world, even today. But what he's saying is, if you had the true spirit of Christianity, love your neighbor as yourself, and love your fellow man, and that sort of thing, that would end a system such as some have to endure and undergo. All right, any thoughts before we get into verse 5? Y'all jump in anytime. Roger, we got an open class, so if you got a thought, just feel free to jump in anytime. All right, so he's still talking about the rich here in verse 5. You've lived in pleasure on the earth. In other words, one of the things that the rich have, they're addicted to gratifying their desires, whatever it is. You remember Solomon talked about that a little bit, where he said, I hadn't kept back myself from anything that I wanted, I had it. And there's a whole long list of things in the first couple of chapters in Ecclesiastes about what he actually had. Of course, he wasn't satisfied with it, but this is what he's talking about here. You lived in pleasure, kind of like the rich man in Luke 16 in a way. The same kind of thing, that he didn't have time for this poor beggar, that the dogs were licking his sores and so forth. He lived sumptuously every day. And this is kind of what he's talking about here, was living in a lavish sort of way and just totally disregarding your fellow man. Go ahead, Israel.
You just said what I was going to say, Coach, that about the rich man.
Rich man.
Every day.
Luke 16. Yeah.
That's a good example.
It's a good example.
He didn't care about anybody else.
Yep.
And Lazarus is the other guy.
Yep. And we know what happened to him, in the story. It doesn't seem to be a parable. And a lot of people think maybe it's a parable, but it doesn't seem to be a parable. It seems to be a true story.
It is, because Jesus in his parables never mentioned an actual
Exactly.
name.
He did there. Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
The other thing about it is, the man knew that he was there because he sat at his gate.
Yeah.
So anytime
Passed by him every day, probably.
Exactly.
Yeah. Didn't even give him the crumbs, that fell from the rich man's table, as it were. So this is what it's talking about. So the Greek word there, I can't read the Greek word, but the Greek word there, of course, means to live in pleasure, or luxuriously live at ease. You enjoy all the things that your money, you are indulging in all kind of things that your money is going to help you to do and to buy and so forth, while those who contributed to your ability to do that, you've left them behind, basically is what he's saying. You hadn't helped them. In other words, the only way that you're there is because these people who have done all these things for you to make it possible for you to have these things, but they're groaning, as it were, under oppression, under a very difficult situation. You have wronged them. They're oppressed, and what he's saying is you are going to pay the consequences for that in time. If not in this world, certainly in the world to come. You've lived in pleasure on the earth and been wanton, W-A-N-T-O-N. I looked that word up. The English word, Albert Barnes says, is now commonly used in the sense of lewd, lustful, or lascivious, but it was applied to anything that was variable or fickle, according to what Barnes says. But the bottom line is that the word wanton there talks about where you lived in pleasure and been wanton. you have no sense of moderation. It's uncontrolled. In other words, it's out of, how do I want to put it? There are no limits to it. In other words, you do whatever you want to do for yourself. In other words, you live in the pleasure and been wanting. Everything is uncontrolled. You spend it on a lavish lifestyle where the people that have helped you get to that point, you care nothing about them. It's just what you can get out of them to help yourself to live in pleasure, to live luxuriously. One of the commentators, one of the things that voluptuously is the way that Barnes puts it. In other words, it's all out there for you. You're living that way, but these people that are under you just barely have enough to exist, kind of thing. There was quite a contrast about what you got. They helped you get there, but you don't care. You don't care anything about them. So he's talking about the oppression of others, and of withholding what is due to those who labor, those who are contributing to it. You're still holding it back. So these acts of oppression and wrong are resorted to in order to obtain the things that you want to do to live in a lap of luxury and to gratify your sensual pleasures or other pleasures and so forth. And as a result, you're going to be punished for that. So the fraud and wrong by which the reward of hard toil is withheld from the person that's under you is connected with that person being lazy, the owner being lazy, and all he wants is indulge in what he wants to do, and so forth. And then he comes to the part about what's going to happen to him. So as a result of all of this, the two or three things that he's mentioned there about withholding more than is necessary, or not spending it, is corroded, is moth-eaten, and all that, and you've defrauded those that are under you. So he sums it up this way, and he's got two or three other things. Even when he gets in verse 6, he's still talking about it. You have nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter. In other words, you have no idea what's fixing to happen to you in judgment, as it were. In other words, you have nourished yourselves, is what he's saying, that they seem to be, and when he's talking about day of slaughter, they seem to be fattening themselves up for the slaughter. Barnes uses the term about stall-fed beast that you're keeping and you're fattening up to be killed. That's the image that he's given there, as in a day of slaughter. So as the cattle are carefully fed and are fattened with a view of their being slaughtered, he says these rich people are the same way. So they seem to have been fattened for the slaughter that was to come on them. So at some point, they're going to be slaughtered. We mentioned Romans 12:19 that where God said through Paul there, "Vengeance is mine; I will repay," saith the Lord. So these that are living a luxurious lifestyle and taking advantage, and this is what they're doing, defrauding or taking advantage of those under them, that they seem to live with only reference to the day of slaughter and to the recompense which awaits them after death. In other words, they may get by with it in this life. Job even talked about that, about all of these. Well, why is everybody so many people just continue to live so much better, when they condemned him and said, well, if you hadn't done all these bad things, this wouldn't be happening to you, and so forth. God's punishing you for all these bad things you're doing, which wasn't the case. But we said, well, why does these people do all these wonderful things, have all this money and so forth, and they seem to be living to a ripe old age? Job saw it even in his day. So these people, they have lived in pleasure. without any restraint, been wanting without any restraint at all, without any consideration for others. And then this slaughter that he's talking about here, let me read two or three Bible scholars, and here's what they say about it. And Barnes is going to get to the point here in just a minute, but he mentions a couple others. I'll just throw this out of what he says. One scholar says this: it's like beasts in the day of slaughter, without care or forethought. In other words, they don't know what's fixing to happen to them. Okay, so that's one way to look at this. In other words, these people that are doing this, they have no idea what's coming. Okay, as in a day of slaughter.
They said they were dumb animals.
Yeah, like dumb animals. The second one is this guy says it supposes that it means as in a festival, referring as he thinks to the custom among the ancients of having a feast when a part of the animal was consumed and sacrificed, and the rest was eaten by the worshipers. So that was the second view of that. A third one says, on such occasions, is what he just talked about, indulgence was given to appetite almost without limit, and the idea then would be that they had given themselves up to a life of pampered luxury. But what Barnes says is probably the more correct idea is that they had fattened themselves as for the day of destruction. That is, as animals are fattened for slaughter. They lived only to eat and drink and to enjoy life, but by such course they were as certainly preparing for perdition as cattle were prepared to be killed by being stall-fed. So that was kind of Barnes' take on it. And that seems to be the sense of what he's talking about here. When you go back to what Solomon said, he uses a similar expression in Proverbs 7. He's talking about this man that goes after this woman that, she lures him in and so forth and so on in Proverbs 7. And he says that he goes like an ox to the slaughter, or as a bird to the snare, till a dart strike through his liver. So it's kind of like these people here, they don't know what's fixing to happen to them. May not happen in this life, basically is what he's saying, but it is going to happen. And so there's a warning for us. I think is what James is saying, that we don't live like that. In other words, we have others in mind. We help those that we can, we help our neighbors, and so forth and so on. And we don't just hoard it, keep it back. We don't defraud people what's their due, and so forth and so on. Because what he's saying is, in those two cases, there's something bad. It's going to end up bad, basically is what he's saying. All right, any thoughts before we get to verse 6? So it continues the thought, you've condemned and killed the just. Now, there are two or three different thoughts about this. Some say that he's talking about maybe the condemnation and crucifixion of Jesus, which I don't think that's really what he's talking about here. He's talking about, the context is talking about people that he's condemned and killed the just. In other words, those who that he just referred to, that he's defrauded or he's hoarded, he didn't help them. And I think that's the sense in which has really been talked about there. And Barnes kind of thinks the same thing, that they had persecuted those who were Christians. They had harsh treatment. They withheld what was rightfully theirs. In essence, you've killed the righteous. You've killed the people that God has blessed. You've killed the just. You have hurt them badly by the way you've treated them, I think is the essence of it. Israel, you got that?
Yes, sir. It seems in context with in the first chapter of James, encouraging them to withstand the trials and persecutions.
Yep.
It's the rich that were really responsible. When you look at why the Jews rejected Christ, it was for preservation of power.
Yeah.
And these people that are being discussed here are those who are interested in the preservation of their own power.
Yep.
And the brethren that are reading that are just like the book of Revelation, seeing they're going to get their reward.
Yep, absolutely.
And that are bringing the persecution upon the brethren.
Yep, absolutely. Good point. Matter of fact, he's trying to encourage these that have been persecuted that God is going to take care of this in time to come. I think that's the essence of what he's saying there. God is going to avenge you eventually of this. And he goes on to say, and he does not resist you. And again, some people think that that's talking about God. In other words, God is allowing it to happen, which in a sense he is, but the context talks about the person that's being defrauded or being mistreated doesn't resist you. In other words, he doesn't have the means, he doesn't have the power, he doesn't have anybody to help him take care of the problem that he's undergoing at this time. And I think that's the essence of what he's saying. And Barnes in his commentary says the same thing. Let's see, he says, the true reference is to the just man whom they condemned and killed. And I think that's the meaning of what he's saying, meaning that they were so powerful that all attempts to resist them would be in vain. In other words, this poor person has no means of striking back. He has no way of rectifying the problem. In other words, you defrauded him, you have everything over him. There's no way that he can resist you. There's no way that he can fight back. He has no means of fighting back. And that the injured and oppressed could do nothing but submit patiently to their acts of injustice and violence. The sense may be either that they could not oppose them, the rich man being so powerful, and they who were oppressed so feeble, or that they bore their wrongs with meekness and did not attempt it. The sins therefore condemned in these verses, and for which it is said the divine vengeance would come upon them, referred to are these four. So here's what he mentions. Here's kind of a summation of what he's talked about in these first 6 verses. That of hoarding up money when it was unnecessary for their real supporting comfort, and when they might do so much good with it. In other words, that's one condemnation. The second one is that of keeping back the wages which was due to those who cultivated their fields, keeping back what would be a fair compensation for their toil. So that's the second one. The third one, that of giving themselves up to a life of ease, luxury, and sensual gratification. That's 3. And the fourth one, that of wronging and oppressing good and just men, which you just talked about, men perhaps in humble life who were unable to vindicate their rights, men who were too feeble to offer successful resistance, or who were restrained by their principles from attempting. In other words, I'm not going to strike back because God tells me to bear it patiently, and so forth and so on. So that's the 4 things that he's condemning in these first 6 verses. All right, any thoughts before we get into verse 7? Y'all jump in anytime. All right, so now, because all that's happened, then he gives them a bit of encouragement where he says, be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. In other words, there's going to be a way that this is going to be rectified. There's going to be a time that everything is going to be the way that it should be. And then he gets into, in just a moment, he's going to get into the farmer that plants the seed. He has patience for how it's going to produce fruit and so forth and so on. He's waiting for the rain and so forth and so on. He has long patience for it. So he's going to get into that. So he's talking about those that he's addressed were suffering from these oppressions and so forth and so on, and they kind of wonder, well, how long is this going to last? When is it going to be solved? When am I going to have a better life for myself and so forth? So his object here was to help them to bear their wrongs without murmuring, without complaining, perhaps without resistance, that there's going to be a day of judgment, there's going to be a day of retribution, that is going to be taken care of. It's going to be at the hands of God. You're not going to have to worry about it. So be long patient, suffer with long patience. We get the word long suffering. The Greek sense of the Greek is to be long suffering. Let not your patience be exhausted. Don't give up hope. So it's a kind of a hopeful thing of what he's saying here, that your courage and forbearance is not to be short-lived, but it's to be enduring. Let it continue as long as there was a need for it, because it's going to be solved eventually. If not in this life, it will be in the life to come. Basically, I think is what he's saying, that you will be released from your sufferings in time. As a matter of fact, what Israel mentioned a while ago, Luke 16, What about Lazarus? It was rectified, but it wasn't rectified on earth, right?
Yes, sir.
So that's an example for us. Go ahead.
It also brings to mind 2 Thessalonians 1:6 and following.
Yep.
If I can read that.
Okay, yeah.
It says, seeing it is a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you. And of course, we know this.
Yep.
And to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, taking
Yep.
vengeance on them that know not God. And of course, that hasn't happened yet.
Yep.
But, waiting for vengeance to come from God is not an ungodly thing to
Yep.
those who are persecuting you
Yep.
as evil people.
Yep.
I know we say, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But you have that imprecatory side where, you're waiting patiently for God to take care of the matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And he will in time. So
He will.
that's a
He'll do
prime
much
example.
better job than we will.
Prime example of it. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. 2 Thessalonians 1:6 through about 9, and then we mentioned a couple of those other verses in Romans 12. And it will be taken care of. Now, this next phrase, unto the coming of the Lord, there are 2 or 3 different schools of thought on that. So let me just mention a couple of things that Barnes mentions. That either it could be removed, it would be solved for you when you die. Okay, that's one school of thought. In other words, the Lord's coming to take you away from planet Earth. Okay, or he mentions also to destroy the city of Jerusalem. And there's another statement in here later on about that which may apply, and I'm not sure it applies here. And bring an end to the Jewish institutions and so forth. That was a second thought. Or the third thought was, or to judge the world and receive his people to himself. In other words, the coming of the Lord was a phrase, it was an event which Christians were taught to expect. In other words, this was over and over in the New Testament. It's drawing near, kind of thing. The day of the Lord is coming, and so forth and so on. Like Jesus in Matthew 24 toward the end. Mark 13, I think it was. What I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. In other words, it's coming. It's coming at some point. As Israel said, it's not here yet, but it is going to come. We got confidence that it is going to come. So the coming of the Lord probably had, in other words, they were thinking of what is it going to take for them to be delivered from their troubles. Okay, so whatever the coming of the Lord means, whether I'm taken out of it and going to paradise, okay, so he came for me in that sense, or the judgment at the end of the world, the 2 or 3 different schools of thought. I'm not sure that it does any disservice to it either way, but in other words, it's going to be solved one way or the other. It'd be solved for us at death, or it'd be solved for when he says, well done, and then the other group depart. So it'll be taken care of in time. And then he gives the example of the farmer or the husbandman. It says he waits for the precious fruit of the earth and hath long patience for it until he receive the early and latter rain. So the farmer waits patiently for the grain to grow and mature and become a crop. And what he's saying is he doesn't get impatient over that. He knows it's going to take 90 days or it's going to take ever how long it's going to take for whatever his crop is, that in due time he can expect a harvest, is what he's saying. So you and I, if we are oppressed or if we have to undergo some of the things that these people were having to undergo, what he's saying is, if you'll wait long enough, it's going to be taken care of. In other words, he's saying don't get impatient. Don't get impatient for this wait. Just as a farmer waits patiently for the regular course of events for his crop to be produced, we can't control God. We mentioned a while ago, we're not on his timetable. 1,000 years in one day, one day is 1,000 years with God. It's just so the course of events here, we can't control and hasten the events. They're in God's own keeping, so we should wait patiently for God to take care of the situation. And the arrangements of His providence is going to be there by which we may attain what we desire. Sometimes we ask for something and we want it right now, instead of, God may not give it to us now. He may say, wait a while, or He may say, I have something better for you down the road. It could be any number of things. So we don't need to we don't need to get impatient when we're dealing with God. He sees, He knows, He cares. He's looking, He's listening, and He's going to help us in due time. There's another expression there, and it just popped in my brain. I can't remember. Because there's a verse that talks about in due time. I can't remember what it is now.
Shall reap if we faint not.
Yeah, we'll reap if we faint not. Yeah, that's it. So the farmer has long patience for it. Notice it until he received the early and latter rain. So he mentions that in that day there were two times. He talks about an autumn rain and a spring rain. The autumn rain talks about the early rain, and the spring rain as the latter rain. In other words, he gets it right when he needs it for the best crop. When he plants the seed, he needs some rain and so forth and so on. And then later on, to make it grow, you've got the other rain and so forth. And here's a statement that Barnes reads that I found kind of interesting. And you guys some of you guys that are climatologists that go with Al Gore and some of them. So I'll read you Al Gore.
Climate alarmist.
Yeah, climate alarmist. So you guys that are Al Gore types, let me just read this. Here's what Barnes says about it. Unless there has been some change in the climate since the times of the New Testament, the early and the latter rains for which the husband waited with longing seem rather to have implied the first showers of autumn, which revived the parched and thirsty earth and prepared it for seed, and the latter showers of spring, which continued to refresh and forward the ripening crops of the fields. And so I just asked a question in the margin there. What about the climate change fanatics of today? After the flood, God said everything's going to be in a certain order. There'll be summer and winter, cold and heat, and so forth and so on. And that really hadn't changed. It changes from summer to fall, to spring, to winter, and so forth. But anyway, I thought you climatologists, or as Israel said, you climate alarmists, would appreciate what Barnes says about that. So basically it hadn't changed. It's probably going the same way, is what he's saying. And unless it has changed, it's still that way in Palestine or over in that area of the world, just as it was 2,000 years ago.
Year before last, I didn't get much rain on my garden, so I had to irrigate. I had to rig up my irrigation. But this past year, I didn't have to water any.
Well, see, climate change, Tom.
Yeah, from one year to the next. Who knows what's going to happen this year?
That's the answer. Climate change.
Yeah, this time of spring, I don't know.
Scott, you got
See if I can say this right. I want to back up just a little bit. I mean, being able to wait on the Lord is exceedingly important as well. But I don't want to make it sound like we are all filthy rich that are sitting in here, but, there are a lot of people out there that are a whole lot worse off than we are.
Yeah, by the world standards, we are
Yes,
in one sense. Yeah.
And so I think we could take it to heart that we would safeguard our hearts and not want to hold back
Yeah.
in our giving.
Yeah.
And we can give more than just one way or another.
Yeah.
We could continue to look for ways to give.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. It says a lot about giving, and it'll be given to us. We don't give in order to get, but like Joel talks about, but that is a benefit of giving. You talk about being patient and waiting on the Lord. There's a great verse that just popped in my brain, Proverbs 27, verse 14. Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Hard for us to do that sometimes, but that's a great passage. I've always liked that passage. It kind of fits in with what we're talking about here about the waiting on the Lord. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your good attention tonight. Appreciate it much.